students, welcome to CivicCentre. In this class, we will discuss about female labor force participation rate. So, first of all, we need to understand about what is participation rate of workforce. Whether if the person is employed or seeking for employment, these are both considered a part of labor force participation rate. Why this was in news? At one point of time, the government of India has claimed that female labor force participation rate is rising, especially in urban areas. On contrast to this, especially from CMIE, Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, there is a separate body which dedicated for inflation, unemployment rate statistics, which has shown a negative comments on the government stand. So let's look at what are the issues, especially female labor force participation rate, and at the same time what were the government of India initiatives, and at the same time what are the major initiatives taken up by government of India so far. So that is the discussion for this class. So if you look at female labor force participation rate, India's high female literacy, especially if you look at after 1990s or especially from 2005 onwards, the female literacy rate, especially from rural areas and urban areas, has been gradually increased, and at the same time the employment opportunities for these female labor force has not been in accordance with the literacy rates. That is the problem, especially in urban areas. Labor force participation rate, especially from women's, remains very low. If you look at PLFS data 2023-24 periodic labor force survey, which highlights a stark rural-urban disconnect. The majority of rural women and urban women, counter urban women, and what were the major unemployment issues, and widening literacy, especially employment gap, rising concerns over inclusive economic growth. So what is inclusive economic growth? Nothing but include each and everyone in the decision making, whether it should be financial decision making according to OECD, Organization for Economic and Cooperation Development. That is the inclusive growth. Can we quote any examples for financial growth or inclusive growth? Right, Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana. So if you take an example of this Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, it is a classic example of inclusive growth. So what was the major objective of this scheme? Unbanked and underbanked will be served, so that each and every family, each and every person, especially after getting 18 years, they will get a bank account, so that they can have a regular transactions, they can have a regular financial transactions and digital literacy. So these are part and parcel of your inclusive growth. If you look at the discussion, especially for this, India needs a larger share of women at work. So what was the major reason? India wants to become a $5 trillion economy by 2047. To achieve this tag, especially developed nation. So each and every time the government has reiterated that India wants to poise as a developed nation by 2047. And it was also popularly known as Viksit Bharat, right? So to achieve this, India needs a equal participation rate of women especially. So if you look at pictures, labor force participation rate, the literacy rates, if you look at literacy rate 70.4 and labor force participation rate is 47.6 or to round off 48. To simply understand this, let's suppose 70 persons are literate, only 48 persons are employed. Whether this employment should be in the form of formal or informal in nature. If you look at India's case, most of the jobs are informal in nature. There is no regular contract, there is no social security benefits, there is no anything which is under the purview of government of India or respect to state government. That is one of the biggest problem that is facing by government. And if you look at for urban women, so this is for rural women component and this is for urban women. So if you look at literacy rate, 84.9, almost 85% of the population are literates. And what about this labor force participation rate? only 28. So that is very dark contracting theory the government is projecting especially. So if you look at the key trends especially from 2023-24 and at the same time World Bank data. World Bank has frequently released the data especially employment statistics. So the first one is urban female literacy 84.9%, at female labor force participation rate is only 28%. What does that mean? The total out of 100, only 28% was from females. They were actively participating in any kind of job. Then remaining should be from men. This gap should be bridged so that each and everyone have a active participation in employment opportunities. And also one of the major problem facing by Indian governments, especially from long decades, is jobless growth. So if you take an example of India's economic growth story, whenever any GDP numbers are growing, what generally we are expecting, the employment rates are also being increased. But that is not the real case. That's why majority of the policy makers or even economists, what they believe is Indian economy is under the jobless growth situation. The growth is there, whether 7% or 8% on an average. But what about the jobs? How many jobs that have been created under GDP? That is nothing but your employment elasticity. Employment elasticity is very low, especially under low and middle income countries. In that, India is also one of the member. So that is the first one. Rural literacy, female force labor participation rate gap when it comes to 22% and urban gap 57%. In urban areas, 57% of the female labor force participation have been gradually come down. But when it comes to rural area, it was 22%. That was a good sign. National female literacy, if you look at national female literacy, 74.6% is the national with a 33-point employment gap. Only 33% of females are not employed. India lies between developed 40-point gap and developing 25-point gap nation. These are the major statistics that were available from female labor force. And what are the causes behind this low female participation rate? So majorly it was structural and at the same time social disconnect. So if you look at the first one, urban job inflexibility. Nothing but if you look at in urban areas, majority of the jobs are in service sectors. These service sectors jobs are very limited for females because of their social contracts, especially after getting into marriages. Obviously, they need to take care of their families. Their first priority should be on that. And second priority should be caring of elders. So these are some of the reasons. This won't be the more of the reasons also, right? If you look at some of the topmost companies, CEOs, there are females. That's a well sign for any growing economy or any growing personalities. But when it comes to urban job inflexibility, mostly service sectors are dominated in urban areas, and at the same time, these are mostly in informal in nature. That is also one of the major problem. Second one, mobility and safety concerns, especially these were very true, especially in urban areas. The safety of women is one of the major issue. Informality and job insecurity. So obviously you can expect majority of the jobs are in informal nature. Whenever they want to hire, they will hire. Whenever they want to fire, they will fire. Simply informality and at the same time job insecurity. That is also one of the major reasons. Child care deficit in cities. If you look at National Family Health Survey 5, 64.5% of families are nuclear in nature, which means the employment does not go from your child care or welfare of the family. That is the latest data from NFFH 5. post maternity workforce dropout, especially after maternity benefits, under maternity benefits acts, majority of the women are dropping from their jobs because of early child care responsibilities. That is also one of the major causes for this shift. And why rural FPR is higher than urban areas? So generally what we thought is, in urban areas majority of the population are working, but in contrast to this, in rural areas, in rural counterparts, majority of the women are working. So flexible working options in agriculture. So majority of the times in rural areas, agriculture plays a dominant role, whether for both male and females. So obviously the females are preferred to go for agriculture. That is one of the major reason. Second one, workout of necessity. So obviously if male counterparts are migrated towards any cities, then obviously out of necessity these females are engaged in works. That is also one of the reason. Gender norms around shared labor. If you look at especially families, so the family's responsibilities should be held with women. That's what our social customs are accustomed to. So that is one of the major reason. Crisis driven employment. That is also one of the major reason for why female labor force participation rate is very high in rural areas when it comes to urban counterparts. So what is the way forward? How can you bridge the gap between rural and urban counterparts so that there is a social equity in employment and other benefits that will be provided? The first one is public child care infrastructure, nothing but your crèche facilities. The crèche facilities should be developed in urban areas also, so that there should not be any disturbance for working women. Flexible employment models, nothing but your hybrid model of workings. After COVID-19, especially these type of hybrid model of workings are very common in India and at the same time rest of the world also. Legislative reforms for dignity at work. From legislative part, necessary action should be taken for the maintaining of dignity of labor and at the same time women. Norms transformation campaigns, obviously. So if you look at 2014 or 15, there is a large campaign regarding the Beti Pachao, Beti Padhao. What was the scheme all about? Nothing but let girl child educate, let girl child study. In a similar way, you should maintain a proper campaigns so that the female labor force participation should be encouraged to participate in workforce. Urban infrastructure for inclusion. So each and every time we are discussing about inclusive growth, but there is a positives and negatives of these inclusive growth. If you look at urban areas, especially these urban areas are clogged with infrastructure deficits, traffics, health issues. So these should be focused by Government of India so that the work flexibility, the working availability of these female force will be very high. So that is the discussion for female labor force participation rate, and let's have a look at one mains question. Despite improved educational attainment, female labor force participation in India remains dismissively low. So this is the key word. Examine the socio-cultural factors responsible for this paradox. So here the question is very straightforward. Just examine the socio-cultural factors. What are the various social and cultural factors responsible for dismissively low participation of female labor force participation? So that is the discussion for today's class. Thank you for watching the class and have a nice day. If you have any doubts, especially from this topic, from labor force participation rate or female labor force participation, and if you want anything new that has to be covered in our regular classes, please do mention in comment section, and at the same time follow our all social media platforms. Thank you for watching class. Have a nice day.